From a field marshal who sent 57,000 men to their deaths in a single day and called it a learning experience, to a general who redirected an entire army to capture a city for a photograph, letting the enemy escape to fight for another year, to the commander whose most famous contribution to history wasn't a battle, it was a hairstyle. These are the 5 most overrated generals in history. And number 2 on this list was so convinced of his own greatness that his own allies spent more time managing his ego than fighting the enemy. Chapter 1. The Butcher. Douglas Haig commanded British forces on the Western Front in World War I and sent more men to their deaths in pursuit of failed tactics than almost any commander in modern military history. On July 1, 1916, Haig launched the Battle of the Somme. By the end of that single day, 57,470 British soldiers were casualties, 19,240 of them dead. It remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. It gets worse. Haig had been warned by his own artillery commanders that the preliminary bombardment, which was supposed to destroy German wire and fortifications before the infantry advanced, had not achieved its objectives. The wire was still intact in many sectors. The German dugouts had survived. He sent the infantry anyway. What followed was not a tactical adjustment, but more of the same. The Battle of the Somme lasted 141 days. Total British casualties reached approximately 420,000. The maximum advance achieved was 5 miles. Haig's reputation in Britain during the war was carefully managed. The press portrayed him as a decisive, competent commander fighting a difficult war. The soldiers in the trenches had a different name for him. They called him Butcher Haig. After the war, his supporters argued that the attrition on the Somme was necessary, that grinding down German reserves was the path to eventual victory. Critics argued that a commander who couldn't find a better way to win than sending waves of men into uncut wire and intact machine guns had no business commanding anything. The debate continues. What doesn't is the casualty count. 57,470 men, one day. Despite the catastrophe, Haig believed the offensive remained necessary and continued the campaign. But Haig at least believed he was winning a necessary battle. The next general on this list redirected an entire campaign for reasons that had nothing to do with winning the war. If you're finding this valuable, subscribe. New stories every week. Chapter 2. The General Who Chose the Photograph. Mark Clark commanded Allied forces in Italy and made one of the most controversial command decisions of the entire war, redirecting his army to capture Rome for the publicity rather than completing the military objective he had been given. In May 1944, Allied forces had finally broken through the German winter line after months of brutal fighting. The German 10th Army was retreating, and for a brief moment an Allied force moving quickly could have cut off their escape route and potentially destroyed an entire German army in the field. Clark had different priorities. He wanted to be the general who liberated Rome. Clark believed capturing Rome carried enormous political and symbolic value. Critics have long argued that the decision allowed Germany's 10th Army to escape. He diverted significant forces away from cutting off the German retreat and pointed them toward the capital instead. The German 10th Army escaped almost entirely intact. They retreated north, established new defensive lines in the Gothic Line, and continued fighting in Italy for another year. The battles that followed cost tens of thousands of additional Allied casualties against an army that should have been destroyed in May 1944. Clark got his photograph. He rode into Rome on June 4, 1944, and posed for pictures outside St. Peter's Basilica. The next morning, Allied forces landed at Normandy, and his moment of glory vanished beneath the biggest story of the entire war. The German soldiers who should have been in prisoner of war camps were still fighting when the war ended in May 1945. But here's what nobody talks about. Clark's Rapido River crossing in January 1944, ordered against the advice of his subordinate commanders, cost over 1,600 casualties with nothing gained. A congressional investigation was launched after the war. Veterans who survived it testified that the operation was tactically unsound from the beginning. Two catastrophic decisions, one Italian campaign, one general whose reputation survived both. Subscribe before the next chapter. The general coming up was so convinced of his own brilliance that his allies spent more time managing his ego than fighting the actual enemy. Chapter 3. The Field Marshal Who Believed His Own Legend. Bernard Montgomery commanded British and Commonwealth forces across North Africa and Northwest Europe. He won major victories during the war, but many historians argue his reputation eventually grew larger than his actual record. His greatest success came at the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1942. Montgomery defeated Erwin Rommel and helped turn the war in North Africa in the Allies' favor. It was a genuine victory. But the operation that defines his critics came 2 years later. Operation Market Garden was Montgomery's bold plan to cross the Rhine and end the war before Christmas. More than 35,000 Allied airborne troops were dropped into the Netherlands. Intelligence had warned that German armored units were near Arnhem, but the operation went ahead. The result was disaster. The British 1st Airborne Division was surrounded, and only about 2,400 of the nearly 10,000 men who landed escaped. The Rhine remained uncrossed, and the war continued for months. Then came the comment that followed him for the rest of his life. Montgomery later described Market Garden as 90% successful, despite its failure to achieve its main objective. To many historians, that remark symbolized the confidence and the ego that made him one of the war's most controversial commanders. His victories were real. Whether his reputation deserved to be quite so large is a debate that still hasn't ended. What Montgomery lost was credibility with many of his allies. The next general on this list lost something even more important: the confidence of the men he commanded. Chapter 4. The General Who Escaped. Douglas MacArthur is one of the most decorated generals in American history and one of the most controversial. His defenders point to his Pacific campaign, his reconstruction of Japan, and his early Korean War advances as proof of genius. His critics point to a career that combined genuine brilliance with catastrophic ego-driven failures that cost thousands of American lives. The Philippines in December 1941 is where the argument starts. MacArthur received warning of the Pearl Harbor attack at approximately 2:30 a.m. on December 8th, Manila time. He had several hours before Japanese aircraft reached his air bases. His staff urged immediate action, dispersing aircraft, launching preemptive strikes against Japanese airfields in Formosa. MacArthur hesitated. Historians still debate why MacArthur failed to disperse his aircraft despite several hours of warning. When Japanese aircraft arrived at Clark Field, American planes were lined up neatly on the runways. Within hours, MacArthur had lost half his air force on the ground. The defense of the Philippines collapsed over the following weeks. MacArthur left. On March 11, 1942, he departed by PT boat for Australia, while 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers remained behind. Those men endured the Bataan Death March. Over 10,000 died in Japanese captivity. MacArthur received the Medal of Honor for the Philippines campaign. And then it got worse. In Korea in 1950, his intelligence dismissed clear evidence of massive Chinese troop concentrations near the Yalu River. His famous prediction that the boys would be home by Christmas, 1950, was followed within weeks by the largest retreat in American military history, as Chinese forces crossed the border in overwhelming numbers. He was eventually fired by President Truman for publicly contradicting presidential policy, something no military commander in a democracy is permitted to do, regardless of how certain they are that they're right. MacArthur was genuinely brilliant in certain campaigns. He was also genuinely reckless in certain decisions and catastrophically unable to separate his own ego from sound military judgment. That combination makes him the definition of overrated, celebrated for the brilliance while the failures are quietly set aside. The last general on this list didn't fail through ego or recklessness. He failed through something almost more embarrassing. Chapter 5. The general remembered for a hairstyle. Ambrose Burnside commanded the Army of the Potomac during the American Civil War, and his most enduring contribution to history was not a military victory. It was the way he wore his facial hair. The word sideburns comes directly from Burnside's name. He wore distinctive strips of facial hair along the sides of his face that became so associated with him that they were eventually named after him, reversed as sideburns rather than Burnsides. That is what history chose to preserve from Ambrose Burnside's career. Not a battle, not a strategy, a hairstyle. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 explains why. Burnside commanded approximately 120,000 Union soldiers against Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee holding defensive positions on the heights above Fredericksburg, Virginia. Lee's position on Marye's Heights was extraordinarily strong, elevated ground behind a stone wall with clear fields of fire across open terrain that any attacking force would have to cross. Burnside ordered frontal assaults anyway, not one assault. Multiple frontal assaults across the same open ground against the same stone wall over the course of a single day. Each one failed. Each one added to the casualty count that by the end of the day reached 12,653 Union soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Confederate casualties were 5,377. One Confederate officer watching the Union charges described it as the most magnificent display of bravery and the most shocking display of generalship he had ever witnessed. Burnside was relieved of command shortly afterward. His reputation as a general exists almost entirely because he was given command. What he did with that command suggests the reputation was never fully deserved in the first place. He is remembered for sideburns. The men who died at Fredericksburg are remembered for following orders from a man who had no better idea than ordering them to charge a stone wall again and hoping the result would be different. 5 generals, 5 different eras, 5 reputations that history built higher than the record actually supports. Haig sent 57,470 men to their deaths in a single day and called it necessary. Clark chose a photograph over destroying an entire German army. Montgomery spent as much energy managing his own legend as he did fighting the enemy. MacArthur received a Medal of Honor for a campaign that ended with 76,000 men left behind. Burnside ordered multiple frontal assaults against the same position and is remembered for his beard. Reputation and reality are not the same thing in military history. They never have been. These 5 men prove it. Subscribe, and if you haven't already, go watch our video on the 7 worst generals of World War II. Click here.